All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Again, this is Ditching the Discomfort with Data Series, Part 4, Analyzing Data. We've been doing this series throughout the year, really, and so we just have one more part after this, and we'll give you some information about that later on in the webinar, about how you can join us for that. Dr. Center is here. He has been with us on this whole journey, and so we're very grateful to have him, and it's been an awesome experience to have him along with us on this journey. I'm going to remind all of you, if you just joined us, make sure your line is muted. It's that little microphone. If you'll just make sure that has a red line through it, that'll make sure we get a good recording today. I appreciate that. All right. So we will move on. So I just want to talk about some acknowledgements before we get started. I won't read this whole thing to you, but you're more than welcome to do that. Basically, we just want to make sure you know that the views expressed today by Hayden or myself or participants are not necessarily the views of SAMHSA, who is our funder at the PTTC network. This work is also supported by our grants, and you can see the numbers for those down at the bottom. And all material in this publication, we just really ask that you cite the material. It is, public information, but we want to make sure that, we cite the work that we're using. So it is in the public domain, maybe reproduced or copied without permission, but please cite the material. All right, well, let's get going on our journey here. So we are at today analyzing data, so our little arrow there. And the last time we talked about working with data. So we are excited to be here. I know analyzing data can be something we all sort of fear, right? That's the part that, we might be okay with collecting the data. We might be okay with, conducting interviews, because as preventionists, we're used to working with communities and kind of doing a lot of facilitation and moderation. But when it comes to analyzing the data, that's something that maybe we aren't as comfortable with. And so today is really important to highlight some ways that you can do this that provide meaning to the work you're doing, but also are practical and are things that you can do. And oftentimes are things that you're already doing. You may not realize it. We just might need to beef up our skills a little bit, right? So that's why we are here today. So we are here for part 4. And then our learning objectives are to describe 2 techniques that look at both analyzing qualitative and quantitative data, apply methods for analyzing data to a case study. So if you've been with us through this journey before, we always have a hands-on activity. And so we'll be doing that today as well, looking at both some qualitative and quantitative data and deciding how we can make some conclusions about that. It is fake data when we get to that point. So I just wanted you to know that, not real life data, but it is supposed to simulate something that may take place in your communities around a problem. So the last part is we're going to list 2 tips for determining appropriate analysis methods based on the available data. So those are our objectives for today. And our roadmap, we've already done some introductions. We will then talk about analyzing data and what it means. We'll look at tips for analyzing data. We'll do our group work. We'll come back and debrief as a large group so we can all talk together about what we found. And then, of course, we have our evaluation at the end and some resources and references for you. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Hayden Center. Some of you are familiar with his work if you've been on this journey, but I just want to highlight a few things. Hayden has done so much, it's hard to really capture all of it. So we'll just list a few highlights, but there are many more that he has accomplished. So he's been most recently on faculty at Auburn University, at Montgomery in the Department of Psychology, where he taught for 10 years. He's also taught at several other universities for almost 30 years. He's a licensed professional counselor, so he brings that lens from a therapist and has done that work in addiction for over 30 years. He has also worked as a consultant in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug abuse since 1987. And he's done a lot of work with the state of Alabama as their coordinator of the state Safe and Drug-Free Schools program. He's also been a consultant to the Alabama Governor's Office, so lots of community and state experience here. He's also an evaluator, so that's partly why he is here today, because he brings the data expertise, but also has that practical end of looking at how he has worked with communities and as well as states. He has also provided over 300 trainings and workshops on science-based prevention, evaluation, risk and protective factors, and sustainability. He most recently has conducted training on implementation science and has worked on projects related to the psychopharmacology of marijuana, which is a really great online course on healthy knowledge with the PTTC that Hayden has helped develop. So I encourage you to look at that. He's done trainings around opioid use disorder, opioid epidemic, and the prevention of opioid overdose death. He's also working on a sustainability toolkit. So welcome, Hayden. So much great work. Hard to put that all in one little synopsis, but we really appreciate having you here today. We also have myself here today. I'm Nicole Shaneborn. I'm your facilitator today. I'm the evaluator for the PTTC, as well as our great team behind us here, helping make all this happen. We couldn't do it without you. We have breakout room facilitators, Dr. Bev Tremaine, Sheila Boswell, and Derek. And so all of you bring such great support to this service. And then our tech team, Wanda, Richard, and Lori, are really making all this happen behind the scenes. So thank you all for being here today.
Well, thank you, Nicole. What an introduction. That's greatly appreciated. And I have been doing this work for a while. Actually, I've worked with this group from University of Oklahoma since 1995 or 96, 97, somewhere in there. So I want everyone who's part of this to recognize that I'm kind of leading this today with Nicole providing a great deal of interaction also. But this group has a wealth of experience, a lot of expertise. And so it's always a pleasure to work with them because they bring so much to this. And they do these training and technical assistance activities. They've been doing it a long time, and they do it with both a great knowledge, but also they're just really nice people. And so if you need further services, Nicole's going to give you some information at the end of the presentation, but let me just tell you, I don't know that you can work with a better group of people. So as we have been saying, we're moving through a 5-part series. And I want to go ahead and kind of forecast what the 5th part of that series will be, is once you have gone through this process and you have data, how do you communicate it effectively? And for me, that is one of the key issues that we have in the field of prevention, in that we do really good work, we have evaluation data, but there are ways to get it out where it not only has integrity of the data, but it also communicates what we're doing and can be used to build the presence in the community, which leads to sustainability. Because the more that people know that you are the group that is working in the community around this particular issue, then the more you become part of the community, and a part of the community that you hope that they see they can't do without. And that's really what builds sustainability in any sort of community coalition or community-based project. And so talking about the data and going through this process so that you can produce data that has strong integrity and that you know something about. You know, that model where you get someone else to do all of the data work and then they hand you a report may not be the best way to do this at all times. And even if you are hiring an evaluator, which you on this webinar may be evaluators, even if you're hiring an evaluator, the more you can get involved in this process, the more you can understand the steps of this process, the more the data is going to be meaningful to you, and the more you're going to be able to use it in your work every day. So that's been the purpose, I think. And Nicole, would you agree that was the purpose as we kind of thought about this and thought about why would we do this and how would we do it? So this has been kind of an overview. There are some parts of this that are really depth that we don't have the time to go into at this point in time, but there may be future trainings around some of this if there's need for some of the more kind of depth aspects, especially in data analysis, because as Nicole said, this is an area that causes some trepidation and fear among people that may not have spent as much time working with data. So as we move towards this, we'll go back to our original kind of framework for thinking about data and talking about data literacy. And that describes the ability to read, work with, analyze, and argue with data. So we're going to focus on the analysis of the data. And as we do that, we actually have a chat that we would like for you to get involved in. So Nicole, if you can go to the next slide, I think we're ready to move forward here.
All right.
So let's hear from you. What do you think of when you hear we are going to analyze the data? And even beyond what do you think, what do you feel? What emotions do you have when you think about analyzing data? And so, you know, again, I've had a fair amount of experience in analyzing data. And I go back to my first bit, it stresses me out, thank you, Susan. Transparency and honesty in the group today. Thank you very much. It stresses you out. I go back to some of my earlier work where we had mounds of data. We did a study at Auburn University with 150,000 students in the state of Alabama. And so as we did that, we had so much data, but how do you take that data and analyze it in a way that makes sense? And then how do you think about that data in a way that you can communicate it to really let people understand what's going on? And it kind of can inform what's happening in the community. Sarah says from overwhelming, and that is cleaning data before analyzing it, painting a picture with the data. And yes, we always clean the data. We talked about that last time and actually gave you some sources and some resources for thinking about that. Keeping it relative to the people in our community. George, you get kind of a gold star today because that's really important. When I think about evaluation, I think about what can we learn? What do we need to learn? What are the questions that we have that'll help us do more effective interventions, more effective strategies, more effective programs? Because we'll know what's going on in the community. And we'll be able to see if those particular approaches that we choose are having an effect. Ashley says having conversations with various stakeholders to help them understand what I'm doing, did, and why. Yes, that's the end product, Ashley. That's what we hope for sure to have happen. So you can continue to chat. Those were great responses. We are going to move on because, as Nicole said, we have a limited amount of time, and we always end early, or on time. Early. We always end on time, and we want to get you involved. So we'll move forward at this point, Nicole.
That sounds good.
We have a chat, I think, at this point, or a poll. is a poll up next? I think a poll is up next. And,
Yeah,
we
just bringing it up.
will to the next slide. So the poll, select the software programs you have experience using for data analysis. And it's okay to choose the last item in that poll. And I'll let you watch that, Nicole.
Sure.
You can post the results when you think that's appropriate. But analyzing data, someone said, again, cleaning the data, and that's always one of the first operations that you engage in, because you don't want to analyze data that may have discrepancies or error in it. So you want to cut down as much on that as possible, especially looking for outliers, other kinds of trends in the data that don't make sense. And, it's real important to do that. And then you filter, sort, aggregate, compare, and then there are other analytic operations. Now, we're going to deal with very, very basic analysis strategies here, because for the most part, in many of our communities, that's really where we need to be. And we'll talk about kind of 3 basic strategies. Let's look here and see what we have.
Got our results here. Looks like most people use Excel, Hayden. Not surprising. And, the great thing about Excel is it's something that most people already have on their computers. So it's not a big investment in terms of software. Microsoft Access at 12%, SPSS, which I'm a fan of, at 21%, and then SAS at 15%. And we have about a quarter of the folks here today that don't have experience using any of these to analyze data. So if you are using something else than what's on the screen, feel free to post that in the chat, because there are other tools out there for analyzing data than what we have listed there. So feel free to do that.
And what we typically see is that people that are using SPSS and SAS tend to be doing more in evaluation, but those are relatively user-friendly approaches. Much more user-friendly than I used to have to do SPSS mainframe, where I had to type command, and if I didn't get it absolutely correct, I got an error message and it didn't tell me where. So I had to go line by line. So it is much easier and much more accessible and doable at the time. So Nicole, if we can move to the next slide.
Sure. And we did have a few more mentioned, Survey Analytics, Hayden, and Survey Monkey. So some of those survey creation software systems now have analysis tools built in. So those are also really useful. Thanks for sharing, everybody. And Bev has posted a resource as well in the chat. Bev always has great resources, Dr. Tremaine. And so there's a resource in there for you with Tableau.
Fantastic. And I use, not to promote any, but I use one of those survey tools that you mentioned, Nicole, very regularly. And it has gotten where they really do help with the analysis. Plus, you are able to take the data and put it into an Excel spreadsheet and then convert it to SPSS or SAS. So it will do some very good descriptive types of analysis for you, or presentation, and then you can build on that. So it really has gotten much friendlier than when I used to have to put data in by hand.
I started out that way too. We had the SPSS mainframe, I think was almost in DOS. So we're really glad to be here today with all these great tools.
Absolutely. Well, I think we have one more chat question for you as we're thinking about, and I'll just go back to, we've talked about the strategic prevention framework, and we've talked about each of these steps that we've talked about so far, and we've made then the connection between your work with the strategic prevention framework and whatever step in this process that we are dealing with. And so if you think about it, it does really run through each of these, but differently. You may be doing assessment and really asking questions then about what's this picture look like in our community? What's the need? You know, what are the trends, the patterns as we continue to plan, or if we're building a new project, what are we going to need to focus on so that we'll kind of understand the problem and start to develop strategies that will be effective and meaningful in the community. When you look at capacity and you look at planning, again, you're probably asking different types of data questions at that point in time. You may even be using different types of data sources at that point. You may be doing some sort of resource analysis where you're looking at the resources that are currently in the community, and then looking at the needs that you found in your needs assessment and doing what's called the gaps analysis and being data driven in that. Well, how do you analyze that data so that it will be most meaningful and assist with that? In the planning process, you many times need to know about who are going to be the recipients of this and have a good knowledge there. And again, you're going to analyze the data with those particular questions in mind. As you implement, you're going to hopefully gather data about short-term outcomes and also who are receiving the services. I've worked with a number of programs, well-intentioned, who had a really good needs assessment and they built the strategies, and then they started to implement the strategies and realized that they were not reaching the populations that they needed to reach. So they had to go back to planning, you know, and use that data to change their approaches and to change the implementation. Where we think about data analysis probably the strongest is in the evaluation phase. And how do you use this data? You know, if you set a baseline with a needs assessment, then you're probably going to go back and look at some of that data and see if there have been changes on some of those data points. And so again, it runs all the way through this process. As I've already mentioned, sustainability and being able to produce good data just go hand in hand. If you look at the literature, that's very, very clear that having capacity in that area is just going to make your community group just much more viable and to be able to access other resources. But cultural competence needs to run all the way through this. And we talked about that in the gathering the data. We need to really think about that as we analyze the data. And we'll even talk about that as we present data. We need to make sure that we're presenting data that in no way is going to cause any kind of misinterpretation around groups and those kinds of things. So all of this is important as we move through the strategic prevention framework. Data analysis is just key in doing a lot of this work. So Nicole, I think we can move forward. Did we have any responses in the chat, or
I didn't see any. Yeah. So if you all notice the chat there, how does data analysis fit within the strategic prevention framework? If you have some ideas about that, just go ahead and post that in the chat, and I'll monitor that. We can go ahead and move forward a bit, just in the interest of time.
I think so, and I think I answered the question for everyone, so giving them a chance, and I apologize for that. But let's go ahead and move forward, if we can.
Sure.
All right, so again, this process of collecting data in that we're going to organize it, design it, gather it, record it, organize it, and we're really kind of talking about now at the organizing part of collecting data. We're going to assume throughout the remainder of the presentation today that we have collected data, that it is meaningful data, and that now we're in clean data, that we're going to work with it and see different ways to organize the data in a way that we can then build those evaluation reports and executive summaries and PR presentations so that it will be helpful in your community. So I think we can move forward from here. So data analysis is all about the relationships. And this is where, in my mind, and we have some very seasoned evaluators that are supporting this, as well as Nicole is a seasoned evaluator. And so feel free to jump in if you like. But, you know, when you first get data, you really just, you know, you look at it and it's just maybe a lot of numbers or words, but you need to see how these things are connected to each other. And so as we start to examine the data, we want to see the relationships, the patterns, the trends. And this is where, again, even if you're not an evaluator, you still can play a really important role here, because you know kind of what you've seen and what your impression is that's happening in the community. And that, for me, like if I do an evaluation with a group, I don't live in the community. And so a lot of the relationships, I can look at them, but getting that local knowledge many times helps me kind of understand the relationships that I'm going to be looking for, or the questions that we want answered. And then as we start to look at these relationships, patterns, and trends, then we'll start to want to put it in some sort of form where we can get ready to share that data. And so graphs and statistics start to show the significance of some of these relationships. And so visuals, as we'll talk about next time, are really, really helpful in not only sharing the data, but I also like to use the graphs and statistics to help me kind of visually look at the data. And also, I'm still looking for those outliers or those things that don't make sense, because I need to go back possibly to a previous step. So data analysis involves both quantitative and qualitative data. And we have been promoting what is called a mixed methods approach to evaluation. So the next time you go to a social event and you want to just be real popular, just drop that, you know, well, you do mixed methods types of evaluations and research, you'll be the hit of the party. I'm just kidding. But it really is, I think, where most of our evaluations are at this point in time, because the qualitative data can be turned into quantitative data. Quantitative data kind of gives you a snapshot of what's going on in a community, but the qualitative data many times also gives you kind of that personal experience that people are having. It may not be representative of everybody in the community, but it is representative of certain members or some members of the community. And many times can help you understand that quantitative data. And many times it also raises more questions for the next time we gather data, and maybe we want to redesign even some of our questions or add questions as part of that. So a combination of quantitative and qualitative data often yields the best overall picture. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking to really understand the overall picture so that we can then start to look at the specifics, which helps us, again, start to plan and helps us, again, the ability to monitor what we're doing and the ability to show that we are producing some sort of meaningful outcome. And so, again, it's a really holistic type process, and I really promote that that's what we want to be about. So why analyze? Well, there are some things that we would be looking for, and I've already kind of talked about some of this, but is there a significant change in the dependent variables you hope to influence? How many of you took a research methods class and remember how much fun that was? In fact, as you woke up at very early in the morning and realized you had research methods at 8 a.m., you got all excited, didn't even need your coffee because you were just so amped up to be able to go and do and study research methods. It was almost as much fun as your statistics class that you loved even more. But just to remind you that a dependent variable is really kind of what you measure to see if there's been some sort of change. And if you're using kind of research methodology, the independent variable would be the different factors that may be different that you're looking to see, for example, back to a basic design.
You're by yourself? Blue are?
Just a reminder, Sabrina, I think you need to unmute. Thank you.
Thank you. Thought I was, didn't know what was going on there. I thought somebody was going to take over the presentation, which I was fine for them doing, if you've got some great input there. But the independent variable, if you go back to kind of a research design, the independent variable might be what you vary, for example, between groups. So if you were looking at, hey, is this program effective? Then one group might get the program and one group not. That would be the independent variable. The dependent variable would be maybe if we're looking at knowledge, and we would look at knowledge as the dependent variable, and then look at the two groups to see if there was a difference in their knowledge, one that didn't get the program and one that did. So when we talk about dependent variables, that's basically what we're talking about. Are there connections between or among various factors that may have effects on the results of your evaluation? And so this again starts, even as I go back before, let's say that you're doing an intervention, a program, and you're working with a certain group and you evaluate and you're not getting changes in that particular group. Well, you might want to go back and analyze, look at the data more specifically about how well did they attend? Is there a relationship between attendance in the group and the change in the outcome? And so that connection of those factors, you find out, most of the people that actually had the greatest need didn't attend most of the groups. And so you go back to the planning stage at that point in time. But I think a lot of us come to the analysis part because we want to find out whether our work was effective or ineffective. And I don't usually frame it quite that way because I don't want us to think about necessarily your evaluation as being the report card on your program, because a lot of times and Nicole, you tell me whether this has been your experience or not. Sure. I almost always find that the outcomes don't tell me that you've been 100% effective on everything, and we just need to continue what we're doing.
That's very true. That's very true. Even with training, right? I mean, except if you're Derek, there's always room for improvement.
Well, so, Derek was that person who woke up on that research methods day and statistics day just so excited to go because he was a high achiever in the class. So we all aspire to be Derek, but most of us.
Oh.
So Derek is not. He's not coming in on that. He'll...
I am.
All right.
We all strive for perfection.
Oh, no, you're absolutely right though, Hayden. I mean, it's rare that when you're working with a program that no matter what you're doing, that there's not going to be some area that we can improve upon. And so it's really crucial to see where those areas are. And that's why, what we're going to talk about later today with cross tabulation even And some of you mentioned breaking down the data. It's really important to break down the data so that we know where we can target our improvements. So.
Yeah, and if you go back to that strategic prevention framework, it's not a step model, and you go back and forth to those different parts of the framework, and a lot of times your evaluation at the end is going to really lean into your next needs assessment as you start to think about, well, we hoped that this would happen, but it didn't. What do we need to do differently here? And you may go back now and look at the data. And you may reanalyze it now that you have new questions, because that might help you as you continually plan. All right, so we will move forward. I want to make sure that we give the groups plenty of time. Benefits of analysis. It provides credible evidence to show funders and the community. And again, you know, one of my major, I'm going to say focuses, maybe it's foci, but one of my major, we've got to sustain our work. And we do that by showing that we're effective. And so this analysis helps us build this credible evidence, shows that you're serious about evaluation, about improving your work, and then paves the way for others to use similar methods and approaches as best practices. So we can move forward, I think, Nicole. So steps for analyzing data. Implement the observational system you've planned, then organize the data you've collected, conduct data graphing, visual inspection, statistical analysis, or other operations on the data as appropriate. Take note of any significant or interesting results, interpret the results, and then, as we'll talk about in the next presentation, next webinar, taking that interpretation and communicating it effectively to those in the community and those very, very important stakeholders. All right, so we're about to give you some data in just a minute, but I want to talk about, again, a concept that I learned about a long time ago because I started out primarily in quantitative data analysis. That's what I was trained in. That's the framework that I looked at most of these issues through, quantitative data analysis. I was lucky enough to have a mentor at Auburn University who was really into qualitative research. And that mentor opened up that idea to me that there are other ways to gather data that can really give you a clearer picture, a clearer story of what's happening in a community or whatever you might be studying. And so I became familiar with this concept called triangulation, which actually, if I'm not mistaken, was originally a nautical term where you would look at different points of where you were, and then you would triangulate those points, and you would be then in the center of that triangulation, and you would roughly know where you are and where you needed to go. I think I got that fairly correct. I'm not a nautical person, but I believe that's where that came from. Well, we do the same thing when we have multiple data sources, and we triangulate the data. And that means that we start to look at this in relation to this, in relation to this, in relation to this, and we start to get a clearer picture of what's going on. So let me just give you an example. Let's say that we are trying to change the attitude about cannabis among our high school students. And so we do a program, we do a pre-test to see what their attitude is. We have an extremely effective program, or an extremely well-designed program. We then look at their attitudes afterwards by asking pre-questions, post-questions, and we know, that 38% said that it had changed their attitude and they were now more concerned about, whatever. But then we do some focus groups and we ask them, how did this impact your attitude? And they start to tell us, I just didn't understand the science. or I didn't realize there's so many websites out there that are giving really kind of false information, or whatever it is. Well, you start to put that data together, you start to understand kind of the changes that you've made. And that will help you then as you continue your process, and it'll also help you as you start to show others your effectiveness. And not only that you change the attitude, but how you change the attitude and the meaning that that had for the participants. So triangulation is a very, very important concept. So we're just going to talk about some very basic ways of looking at data, but I'm going to be absolutely honest with you. And again, Nicole, you can tell me whether I'm off base with this, but
Okay.
if you pay attention to these three, the majority of time doing coalition work, that's what you need.
Absolutely.
And the good thing about that is, again, it is within the grasp of most of us to be able to do this with, again, some of the tools that we've talked about before. And even some of those like survey tools, we can look at some of this. And so when you talk about, I'm going to start with the middle one first, the descriptives. You know, you're just talking about what's the data tell us? You know, how many people are have actually participated in this program? What is the identification of those people in particular groups? Descriptives just tell us, you know, a lot. Sometimes they're called demographics and descriptives, but they're just really kind of a basic showing of the data. Frequencies start to tell us how much something's happening in a data set. And frequencies become pretty important. All of you, I'm sure, are doing some sort of prevalence survey, have access to prevalence survey data. Or you're going to look at the frequencies. How many, and if you really want to be concerned in your community, go look at how many of your 11th or 12th graders are having 5 or more drinks in a row and getting in an automobile. Or how many of your 11th and 12th graders are actually having 5 or more drinks in a row in the last 30 days. It'll start to concern you when you start to look at that. But then what we really kind of wanted to focus on with our data analysis was what we call crosstabs. And that's looking at, and this is the quantitative part, that's looking at how did the responses on this particular item, if we look at now the responses on another item and we cross-tabulate that, what can we learn about that? So crosstabs become a really, and Nicole, again, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I find it an underutilized analysis technique.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I learned an awful lot about what's going on when I start to look at those cross tabulations.
Definitely. So one thing that, you know, just in PTTC work that we can look at is we have our outcome measures, right? But if you crosstab that with the role of the person filling out the survey, you get some very different responses. And so that helps you understand what roles are having issues with different things or having success with different things, and where do we need to focus our work. So that's the benefit of crosstabs.
Fantastic. Thank you, Nicole. You always come through. And I greatly appreciate it. Let's move to the next slide.
Sure.
And now, hey, we want you to think a little bit. I want you to look at this, and then we have, again, a chat, I believe, prompt that we will put in the chat room. And I'm really not going to speak as much as I have. I'm not going to take this away from you as I did before. I want you to think about this and start to provide kind of some of what you see here. How would you use this? And what would it mean to you? And this is actual crosstab data.
Yes.
from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which CDC conducts, I think, every other year, if I'm not mistaken. Or every year at this point. I know in Alabama we did it every other year. And so this is actual data. So we're going to give you a chance to look at this and think for a minute, analyze, think. Those are probably somewhat synonymous or close in relation, and let you start to tell us what you see.
Yeah, so you all can post just some conclusions that you can see from the data in the chat. And you're also welcome to open up your line if you'd rather just talk instead of type. So feel free to do that as well.
Very good. We are going to keep Derek on mute because he will.
Oh no, poor Derek.
I'm sorry. Right, Derek. He's not even going to respond at this point.
There he is. He's just shaking his head. Oh. And so far, not seen anything in the chat. But again, if you want to open up your lane, there are some helpful tips below to each graph.
Drinking alcohol contributes to a higher likelihood of getting D's and F's.
Right.
Good, thank you. Anybody else? This is going to be on the final, so you will want to make sure that you're responding here. Is class participation part of the final grade, Nicole?
Well, since we don't necessarily operate that way, we typically don't give grades, but it's always appreciated when you open up your line or put something in the chat. Looks like we may have another comment.
Those who have lower grades are more likely to drink alcohol.
Very good.
So there seems to be a relationship, but there you go. Thank you, Beverly. Beverly is, you could also look at it as a cause and effect. Which one's contributing to the other? That would be important too, to think about that.
And notice, oh yeah, there's some more here.
Crosstabs, would it not? I'll let you read those that are coming in now, Nicole.
Okay, let me scroll on up here. So we have, or those who drink alcohol and have lower grades may share common risk factors. Good. And then George says there are a higher percentage of youth who don't do well in school starting to drink at an earlier age. Very good. And just to back up on what Dr. Tremaine was saying, Beverly, she indicated too at the end, you could then take this data to a group of students and ask them for insight. So Bev is bringing in that mixed methods that we've been talking about throughout today's presentation. You get that initial quantitative data, and then you can go back and ask more questions with qualitative data so that you can find out what's going on.
That's excellent, and I've done that many, many times with data. And it will help you understand, hopefully start to understand this relationship better. Fantastic.
All right.
Well, Nicole, I think in the interest of time, we probably need to move on. Oh, wait,
Yeah.
you got some A's and B's?
Oh, yep, we've got a couple more. Those with A's and B's have percentages of alcohol use that are closer together compared to greater alcohol use in lower grades. Good. And then Bev says, your wisdom with the data is with the people who experience it. Yeah, that's really powerful.
That should be the opening quote in the book that you write, Beth. does get back to the idea that we want to build a realistic view, a depth view of what's going on in the community. So beautiful. All
It's
right, well,
back to that story that we want to create with the data.
And really, next time we meet, we're going to give you examples of those stories, and hopefully you start to see how all this comes together, because that story is real important. But let me go back and just emphasize something that's very, very important. You cannot create the story if you don't have the data. So you have to think about this all the way through the process. And I think I mentioned this in the first presentation webinar that we did. The first thing that I'm going to ask you, if you decide that I will work with you as your evaluator, I'm going to ask you, what do you want these final products to look like? Because if we don't think about it early, then sometimes I've had many times where I've been asked, sometimes even in very public forums, well, what about this and this? And I'll have to say, well, I can't answer that because I don't have the data to answer this and this. So again, it's a very thoughtful process. But again, it may be the second time that you go through that you now know the questions to ask. And the third time, you may even know more questions to ask. It is an iterative process. Talk a little bit about qualitative analysis. What's the value added? Keep it simple. And I think, again, we have a chat here to just see if you've used any kind of qualitative analysis techniques in the past. You know, I'll just tell you that I'm at a point in my career that I do a lot of stories of not necessarily the good old days, but just the old days. And in my first approaches to qualitative data analysis, we used to, you know, do the transcriptions, for example, of maybe a focus group, and you do several copies, and then you're cutting up all these, all the quotes, and you're building these, so you have a big table, and you're putting quotes that you think go together here, and building themes and building relationships, and it's a mess. And you've got it all over the place, but eventually you get others to look at it, and they validate, you know, yeah, that seems, you know, to be, and then others say no, and you work that out, and ultimately you make some kind of, I guess, understanding of what's going on. But it's a process, again, that we still use the same thinking that back when we used to use the tables and the cut-ups and doing all that, but now there are easier ways to do it. And so on the next slide, I believe that we have given you just an example of coding for analysis. There's software now that does this for you. You can also use Excel, for example, you know, and other approaches to reorganize the data, looking at, for example, comments that may go together, starting to build themes, also looking at, you know, a lot of times you'll have you get back to that idea of kind of how you think about the data. You may have data that doesn't agree, you know, so how do you think about that? How do you organize it? And eventually, how do you present it in a way that has integrity? Now, there's a couple of things that I really want to emphasize here about analysis. The first is, what I'm usually looking for is what I call saturation of the data. When I have heard things so many times or seen them so many times that I'm pretty sure if I do another focus group, I'm going to hear that again because I've heard it many times, then I start to have a lot of confidence in that data. And so when you look at that kind of repetition of similar types of comments, you have to be careful with singular comments, because that might just be something that particular person experienced, but at least most of the people that you've been getting data from have not experienced. But it might also be important to consider those outliers. Sometimes you can learn something from those, and you might want to then, in focus groups, sometimes I change slightly the way I go about them as I continue to do more groups, because I've learned or I've gotten some things. Well, we probably need to find out about that. Well, only one person mentioned it, but it's important enough that we probably need to make sure, and see if other groups, we didn't anticipate that as we built the questions or as we built the protocol. So this is an example of coding for analysis. Focus group analysis, as I've already mentioned, what patterns emerge, what are the common themes, what new questions arise, and what conclusions seem true, which I think I just talked about all that. It's amazing sometimes that I actually foresee some of these things as I'm talking. So anything that you would add, Nicole? Not that you need to, but again, I find focus groups, I find other ways of looking at qualitative data to just be a rich source of information. But let me tell you the one thing to watch out for. Probably several, but this is the one thing. Don't pick and choose the quotes that you want to prove your point. Go through this analysis process. And that's why you step back, and it's always good to get other people to look at it also, so that when you present the data, you haven't just taken what you wanted and then neglected what you don't want.
Right.
And that's real important, especially if you're using this, to look at your services, for example. Well, yeah, I would love to, just have all great quotes, but we don't learn from that. And again, a balanced approach and even a balanced report is probably going to have more credibility. But it's what we should be doing. So just be cautious about doing that. Take a more thoughtful approach to analyzing, for example, if you're using focus group data. I think, Nicole, that brings us to the time we're ready to go into small groups here.
Yeah. And just before we do that, just to wrap that up, what Hayden said, that getting that, what they call the inter-rater reliability, having those other folks there to look at what was said to come to some sort of agreement is really valuable. Or, it may just be your own bias in analyzing the data. So that's a really great point. So we are ready for our getting through our case study here. And I think that all of you are fairly familiar with this, but Community X has been meeting for about a year. They are now working on developing a data analysis plan for the data they have collected on local problems, risk factors, and protective factors. And so our case example, just to review, they decided to analyze data from the 3 different sources with 8th, 10th, and 12th graders in the school system, focus groups with parents, and then key informant interviews. And so we've been over this past journey looking at all of that data and kind of, getting familiar with that. And today we're really going to add some new data to that to get you some practice. So this was the original Monitoring the Future survey results. And we looked at those, looked at what other data we might need to collect, those kind of things. Look at the significant increase in the red, the significant decrease in the green. And so today we're here to look at some actually made up data for the breakouts. And so you should have a handout that's in Word. And we're going to also post that in the chat so that that's available. And we'll also make sure that's available when you go to your breakout room. So in your breakout rooms for part 1, you will follow the handouts instructions, but basically you'll review the crosstabs, and it's a very simple crosstab, so it shouldn't take too much time. You'll look for relationships and patterns, and then what conclusions can you draw from the crosstabs. For part 2, you'll then move on to the qualitative data and review the focus group data in the handout provided. what are some common themes and patterns, and how do the patterns and themes relate to the quantitative data? So that is all outlined in your handout, but I just wanted to walk through that with you so that you were aware of that. So the breakouts will be happening momentarily, but there will be 5. You will each have a facilitator in the room with you from our team to help guide you. We encourage participants to share their screen and camera. So one of you may decide to be the note taker, share your screen and type into that Word document as you go along. And then another may decide to help guide the group through the instructions. So welcome back all. As typical, we love our discussion, but we are short on time. So Dr. Center, maybe we just hear from one group and then we can move quickly through the concluding slides to our evaluation so we can make sure we hit that as well.
Okay.
So.
Well, that'll be fine. I think I found in our group, that we raised many questions after we started looking at those relationships. And I found that the discussion actually really became much more deep and quality oriented as we started to really analyze the data and think about it. I guess we could say from the other groups, was that the trend that you saw? That we really just started a discussion as we started to look at this. Nicole, your group?
Yeah, we saw similar things, and also we noted that there wasn't a lot of data with the quantitative to be able to break it down. And so one of the things we may need to go do is go back and do some more sampling to get more accurate data, right? We know this was fake data, but that may be important. But we did see that while the older students may be drinking more, the younger students are drinking more on school property. And so then
Right.
the qualitative data really helped us kind of point to what was happening. So maybe we need more supervision and band.
See that band, and we're not picking on band.
No.
All just made up data. But did you see that? Is that something most of you came up with? Yeah,
Yes. We definitely came up with that in there, and we were also able to look at the delivery method as well. That would be some place where a coalition could make some changes, or even the school could make some changes. So we found the qualitative data to be the most useful, and the quantitative data, it gave us a little bit of guidance into the direction we should be looking at as far as the population, but definitely the qualitative data was very useful.
Yeah.
Very cool. Eric, Bev, did you have anything to add? Your mic is off.
Oh, no. Yeah, I just said that they need to do an environmental scan in band hall.
And I am sorry, you all. I am a band person, so I
am too.
Just so you know.
But no,
nothing against band folks.
Yeah, I think the group we were talking about how, we're so part of organizations, we're so part of these social institutions, and belonging to certain ones can be either good, or there can be other individuals in that same group who maybe possibly can lead the group in different directions. So we talked about that your organizations, I think, can set a stage for how people act and behave, and also one person would maybe do one thing, but then you get 10 people together and it changes, the whole group changes. So and I think band, being how they're so close, that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well,
Yeah,
Nicole,
one thing that came out with us, Hayden, is that the fact that it's thought to be a protective factor to have youth involved in activities, but instead it could also be a risk factor.
Right.
What happens activities that decides whether it's going to be pro-social or anti-social.
Yes, that's very true. Yeah.
Move forward, Nicole? I've not.
Yes, we do need to move forward in the interest of time. So I will take us through these last few slides fairly quickly, but you will get all these materials and our evaluation will come up also as you all exit. But we really have enjoyed having all of you here today. So be sure to come with us on our next leg in the journey, our last leg. And we're going to post the link to register for that in the chat there. Thank you, Lori. I've got my contact info here if you have any questions. And then we do have several references from today's presentation that you can access when you get those materials with links. And I want to point out these resources, particularly the community toolbox, which we did really incorporate a lot of that information today. And there's some quick short videos on using Excel for cross tabulation at the bottom. And also a great video on how to collect and analyze focus group data.